Let's talk about one of the most powerful things you can do when you're feeling undervalued, overlooked, or taken for granted in a relationship. Go silent, but not out of spite, not to be passive aggressive, not as a game. You go silent to recalibrate your energy. Here's the problem: when you're always available, when you're constantly giving, texting, showing up, adjusting, compromising, eventually your presence gets taken for granted, not cherished. And what happens when something is always there? We stop looking for it. We stop appreciating it. Now listen, I'm not saying disappear into the shadows and hope someone comes chasing after you. No, this isn't about vanishing. This is about transforming. When you go silent, don't just sit around in your room refreshing his Instagram story. That's not silence. That's obsession in disguise. Instead, fill that silence with movement. Go hit that goal you've been procrastinating on. Go be seen, be vibrant, be magnetic, but not for him, for you. Let him wonder where that energy went. Let him feel what life is like when you're not constantly orbiting his world. Because here's the secret: your silence should echo with presence. It should make him say, "Wait, where is she? Why do I feel her gone?" in a way that actually matters. You see, people notice absence when they're used to a certain presence. But even more than that, they miss what they can no longer access. And when you re-enter the conversation, maybe it's weeks later, maybe it's months, come back evolved. Be the version of yourself that's been busy becoming better, not bitter. Show up glowing from growth, not thirsting for closure. Because the goal is never just to make someone miss you, it's to make them respect what they almost lost. So if you're feeling overlooked, go silent, go inward, then go build. And when you're ready to speak again, do it with the quiet power of someone who no longer needs to be heard to feel whole. Too often, when we talk about silence in the context of relationships, people mistake it for manipulation. They think going quiet is a form of passive aggressiveness or a game to get attention. But true silence, intentional silence, comes from a place of inner strength, not emotional immaturity. It's not about hurting someone else. It's about healing yourself. It's about stepping back, not because you want to make someone chase you, but because you need to reconnect with your own voice, your own value, and your own peace. When someone disrespects your boundaries, disregards your emotions, or begins to assume that you'll always be there, no matter how they show up, the worst thing you can do is keep speaking into the void. Words lose weight when they're never met with action. Repeating yourself, trying to convince someone of your worth, over-explaining how you feel, it doesn't make them value you more. It just makes them feel like they don't have to change. Why would they if you're always there, explaining, forgiving, and staying? Silence is how you begin to shift that dynamic. Because silence says, "I've said what I needed to say. Now I'm going to show you what happens when I stop." The beauty of silence is that it's undeniable. You can ignore a message. You can argue with words. But silence, you feel that. It creates a space, a vacuum, where someone can actually sit with the consequences of their actions or inactions. It disrupts their rhythm, especially when they've gotten used to your emotional labor, always filling the gaps. Silence is the space where people start to reflect, not because you're punishing them, but because you've stopped cushioning them from the discomfort of reflection. Silence isn't loud, it doesn't demand, it doesn't accuse. That's what gives it so much power. It forces others to meet themselves, to notice the absence of your presence, your effort, your energy. And if someone truly cares, that space will feel empty, not because you were trying to punish them, but because they've realized what it means to be without your light. But let's be honest, silence is uncomfortable, especially when you care. Especially when you're used to fixing things through communication, nurturing, or emotional expression. The instinct to reach out, to explain again, to soften the silence with just one more message, it's strong. That's why silence is a power move. Because it requires restraint. It demands self-respect. It tells your anxious attachment, your people-pleasing tendencies, your inner fixer, Not this time. We're not going to break our own peace to convince someone else of our value. You see, true silence isn't empty. It's full of boundaries. It's full of growth. It's full of the energy that you used to pour outward, now being directed inward. And what happens when you take all that energy back to yourself? You become magnetic. Not because you're trying to, but because people can feel when you've stopped reaching and started rising. Your silence begins to glow. It starts to say things without saying a word. It says, I'm not playing this game. I'm not chasing. I'm not begging. I've found something more important than your approval. My peace. And yes, people will notice. Some will feel threatened by your silence, because it breaks the control they thought they had. Others will be intrigued, even inspired, by the strength it takes to not react, not lash out, not seek validation. Either way, your silence becomes a mirror. It shows people who they really are, without your voice softening the truth for them. Sometimes that truth wakes them up. Sometimes it doesn't, but by then it doesn't matter as much, because you've already chosen yourself. So no, silence isn't a punishment. It's a reset. It's a clearing of emotional clutter. It's where you go when words have been wasted and explanations have expired. And the best part, it's yours. No one can interrupt it, twist it, or argue with it. It's the most elegant boundary you can set, and one of the loudest declarations of self-worth you'll ever make. Emotional contrast creates value. It's one of the most overlooked truths in human connection, yet it shapes the way we experience people, relationships, and even love. Think about anything in life. What gives something meaning is not just what it is, but how it stands out against what it's not. Joy feels joyful because you've known sadness. Peace feels peaceful because you've known chaos. And in relationships, presence feels valuable because at some point there's been an absence. Without contrast, even the best qualities fade into the background. They become routine, expected, ordinary. When you're always available, always agreeable, always responding, always giving, what you offer starts to blend into the everyday. Not because it's not worthy, but because it becomes predictable. Human nature doesn't always appreciate what's consistent. It's drawn to novelty, to change, to the things that make us feel something different. That's not a flaw, it's psychology. And if you don't understand that, you might keep overgiving, overshowing, overstaying, thinking that more presence equals more love, when in fact, it often leads to less impact. Emotional contrast isn't about playing games or being inconsistent just for the sake of drama. It's about creating texture in how you show up. Moments of deep warmth, followed by moments of distance. Times when you're fully engaged, followed by times when you're focused on your own world. That space doesn't create confusion when done intentionally. It creates curiosity. It creates a sense of rhythm, of anticipation. It gives someone the chance to miss you, to reflect, to notice how much better their day feels when your voice is part of it. And in that noticing, your value rises. When someone feels they have you on emotional speed dial, the dynamic starts to shift. You may still be the same caring, loving, generous person, but the emotional weight behind your words begins to fade. Your compliments don't land the same. Your presence doesn't excite the same. Why? Because there's no contrast. There's no difference between having you and not having you. But when you start to pull back, when you step into your own energy, when you go a day or two, focusing solely on your growth, your fun, your friends, suddenly the next message you send hits different. Not because the words are any better, but because the person receiving them is now tuned in. They're paying attention. They're aware of your emotional rhythm. Think of it like music. If a song had no changes in tempo, no shifts in tone, no pauses between the beats, it wouldn't move you. It would feel flat, monotonous, emotionless. But when the music builds, slows down, drops, rises again, it moves you. That's the emotional journey. That's what creates connection, and you are no different. If you're always on, always offering a smile, always available for a call, always ready to forgive, always responding within seconds, where is the rhythm? Where is the space for someone to lean in, to wonder what you're thinking, to feel the moment when you're not there? What happens in your absence is just as important as what happens in your presence. Emotional contrast teaches people to value your energy, not because it's withheld, but because it's not guaranteed. Because you are not always on display. You are not a vending machine of affection. You're a human being with an inner world, with cycles, with shifts. When you let yourself embody that, you stop being emotionally convenient, and you start becoming emotionally significant. This doesn't mean being hot and cold, or emotionally erratic. It means being intentional, being self-aware. It means understanding that your love is a gift, not a given. That your emotional energy is sacred, not automatic. And the moment you start creating contrast, you invite someone to feel again. You bring texture back to the relationship. You allow space for them to appreciate the highs, because they've known the quiet in-betweens. People often say they want consistency, but what they really want is reliability with mystery. They want to feel emotionally safe, but still surprised. That's emotional contrast. That's showing up deeply, and then pulling back to let the other person breathe and feel your absence. That's expressing love, and then shifting the focus inward to refill your own cup. That's knowing that your presence has power, but only when you occasionally step back and remind the world that it's not something to take for granted. Fill your silence with substance. That's the difference between disappearing and evolving. Silence, when misused, becomes a passive waiting room. A place where you sit, check your phone 100 times, and wonder if he'll notice your absence. But that kind of silence is hollow. It's a void, not a statement. Real silence, the kind that commands respect, shifts energy, and reclaims your power, is not just an absence of noise, it's a presence of purpose. It's what you do with the quiet that makes it meaningful, because silence alone doesn't transform you. What you build in the background does. When you choose to step back, when you go quiet, not to punish, but to protect your peace, what you do in that space matters. Too many people think the silence is the move, but the silence is just the container. The move is in how you fill that container with growth, with joy, with discipline, with clarity. It's the decision to use the time away from someone, not to obsess over them, not to scroll through every digital breadcrumb they've left behind, but to return home to yourself. To remember who you are when you're not seeking validation, when you're not waiting for a reply, when you're not bending to fit into someone else's emotional availability. Filling your silence with substance means going back to the parts of yourself that may have been quietly neglected. The routines that made you feel strong, the friendships that made you laugh, the ideas that excited you before you got distracted by someone who couldn't show up. It's about not wasting that silence in self-pity or anxious overthinking, because that just keeps you stuck. It's about pouring into your own life so much that when you return, if you choose to, you're not returning to chase, you're returning to choose. There's a big difference. You don't go silent to be missed. You go silent to become unshakable. Because when you use that quiet to build something, whether it's your confidence, your business, your fitness, your peace, you become harder to forget. Not because you were loud about your absence, but because your return is undeniable. It carries a different energy. It speaks through your glow, your composure, your stillness. That's the substance. It's not about showing him what he lost by posting curated stories and cryptic quotes. It's about becoming someone who doesn't need to perform absence. You live it, you embody it, and your evolution speaks without you needing to. Substance looks different for everyone. Maybe for you it's therapy. Maybe it's morning workouts. Maybe it's reconnecting with your creativity, or planning a trip alone. Maybe it's just learning how to sit with your own thoughts and not panic. All of that is substance. All of that is growth. And growth is what creates real emotional distance. The kind that isn't spiteful, but powerful. Because when someone senses that you've used the silence to become more grounded, more self-possessed, more fulfilled, they start to feel the contrast. They remember the version of you who was always available, always waiting. And then they notice the new version. The one who isn't reaching, isn't checking in, isn't hoping for breadcrumbs. That shift is magnetic. But it doesn't happen by accident. It happens through intention. Through choosing, every day, to replace the urge to check in with the choice. To check in with yourself. Every time you resist the temptation to break the silence with a "hey, just wondering" text, and instead ask, "What do I need right now?" that doesn't involve him. You are filling your silence with substance. You are building emotional muscle. And that's what gives your silence real weight. Not because it hurts him, but because it heals you. You'll know you filled your silence with substance when you no longer fear the silence. When it no longer feels like a punishment, but a privilege. When you look around at your own life and realize you don't need his response to feel seen, heard, or worthy. You see yourself now. You hear your own needs. You honor your own presence. That's what makes your absence powerful. Not because it forces him to feel the gap, but because it reminds you that you were never meant to be waiting in it. Create curiosity, not confusion. There's a fine line between being intriguing and being emotionally unavailable, and mastering that difference is everything. When it comes to power dynamics in relationships, when people say, "Be mysterious," what they often end up doing is withdrawing, acting aloof, or playing mind games. But that doesn't create attraction. It creates frustration. True mystery is not about being unreadable or emotionally distant. It's about having enough depth, enough confidence, and enough self-awareness that someone naturally wants to lean in, to know more, to understand what makes you tick. Curiosity pulls people closer. Confusion pushes them away. Curiosity is the quiet invitation. It's the subtle shift in energy that makes someone think, "There's something more here, and I want to explore it." It's the moment they realize you're not just responding to them, but living a life that goes beyond them. You're not over-explaining your every move. You're just making moves. And when someone can't quite pin you down, not because you're inconsistent, but because you're multifaceted, they begin to invest emotionally. They become more attentive. They notice the small things. They try to read between the lines, not because you're being unclear, but because there's a richness to your energy that invites exploration. Confusion, on the other hand, is a relationship killer. It happens when your behavior sends mixed signals. When your words say one thing, but your actions say another. When you disappear without context, or respond with cold detachment, thinking that distance will make you more desirable. That's not mystery. That's insecurity wearing a mask. And the problem with confusion is that it doesn't just keep people guessing, it keeps them doubting. Doubting your interest, doubting their value, doubting the entire connection. Eventually, people don't stay curious about something that makes them feel unsafe or unsteady. They walk away not because they aren't intrigued, but because they're tired of trying to decode someone who doesn't know how to communicate. Creating curiosity is about balance. You offer just enough insight to spark interest, but not so much that everything about you is instantly obvious. You share your thoughts, but you don't overshare your strategy. You're emotionally present, but you don't need to lay every detail of your internal process on the table. When someone asks about your day, you don't need to list every hour. Instead, you say something real, something textured, something they can ask more about. That's how curiosity grows. Not through withholding, but through intentional sharing. Through showing who you are in layers, not all at once. This also means knowing when to speak and when to hold back. When you're upset, you don't explode or disappear. You let your silence speak, but you don't leave someone hanging in emotional limbo. You say, "I need space to process. I'll come back to this." That creates curiosity and respect. That shows maturity. It communicates that you're not shutting them out. You're just not reactive. And when you return, your words hold more weight. Your presence feels more powerful because you're not creating drama. You're creating space for reflection, for meaningful interaction, for emotional awareness. The key is intention. Confusion is accidental, rooted in fear, anxiety, or avoidance. Curiosity is deliberate, grounded in strength and self-possession. You create curiosity when you walk into a room and bring your full energy without demanding attention. When you leave a conversation with a thoughtful smile, not a cryptic exit. When your social media shows moments of your life, not messages to provoke jealousy. When your silence is filled with your growth, not passive-aggressive withdrawal. When someone asks you what you're thinking, and you give them something real, but leave just enough unsaid to invite them deeper. People are naturally drawn to what they can't immediately define, but they also need clarity. The sweet spot is when they don't have to wonder if you like them, but they still wonder what's going on in that brilliant mind of yours. They feel emotionally safe, but mentally intrigued. They trust your intentions, but they crave more of your essence. That's the power of true curiosity. It makes someone think about you long after the conversation ends. It keeps them leaning in, not because they're confused, but because they know there's something worth discovering. And that discovery becomes addictive, not because you're hiding who you are, but because you reveal it with purpose, with timing, and with a level of grace that leaves an impression they can't shake. Return different, return elevated. That's the move that changes everything. Not the silence, not the distance, not the waiting. It's who you are when you come back. That shifts the story. Anyone can go quiet. Anyone can walk away. That's not the hard part. The power comes when you use that space to evolve so deeply that the version of you that returns is no longer seeking, no longer proving, no longer craving what you used to settle for. The return isn't about reconnecting with them. It's about reintroducing you. When you leave a situation, especially one where you felt unappreciated, overlooked or taken for granted, the instinct might be to prove a point, to show someone what they lost. But that kind of return is still rooted in reaction. It's still about them. An elevated return, though, is different. It's not a performance, it's not revenge, and it's not a game. It's a transformation that speaks for itself. It doesn't need an announcement. It's visible in your energy, your presence, your pace. You don't have to say you've changed. People feel it in how you move. An elevated return is when you walk back into the room and no longer ask, "Do you still want me?" Instead, you carry an unspoken question. Am I even interested in what I once tolerated? It's when your standards aren't spoken, they're lived. When your boundaries don't need to be debated, they're respected. Because now you've tasted what it's like to focus on you, to build something real from the inside out, to become emotionally self-sufficient. And once you've lived there, you don't rush to rebuild what was. You pause to ask whether it still fits the person you've become. You come back elevated when you've done the inner work, not the Instagram kind, the real kind. The late-night conversations with yourself, where you faced your patterns, your people-pleasing, your fear of being alone. The mornings when you didn't want to get up, but you did. The moments you stopped scrolling, stopped reaching, stopped explaining yourself to people who weren't listening. The days you chose your growth over temporary comfort. That's what builds you. That's what makes the return undeniable. You're no longer the version of you who needed validation to feel worthy. You've already given that to yourself. And what happens when you return like that? Everything changes. The way people respond to you shifts. The energy you command increases. It's not because you've become harder or colder. It's because you've become clearer, more grounded, more whole. You're not trying to convince anyone of your worth. You're simply living it. And people can't help but notice when someone who used to overextend now moves with discernment. When someone who used to explain now simply observes. When someone who used to rush now responds with calm, measured grace. Elevation is magnetic, not because it's flashy, but because it's real. And in a world full of noise, the quiet confidence of someone who knows their value stands out. People are drawn to that. They feel safer around someone who isn't trying to prove anything. Someone who's done the work, who's carrying peace instead of pain, who shows up not with a need, but with an offering. And ironically, that's often when the person who once didn't see you clearly starts to pay attention. But by then you're not returning for them. You're returning as you. And that's the key. You don't return to pick up where things left off. You return with a new rhythm, a new frequency. You might still have love, but now it's wrapped in wisdom. You might still care, but you're not available for what doesn't meet your new standard. You're not bitter, you're better. You're not colder, you're calmer. You're not harder, you're healed. That's elevation. It's not about looking down on who you used to be. It's about honoring that version of you for surviving, while stepping into a new one that's ready to thrive. When you return different, people don't always know what changed, but they feel it. In your pause before answering, in your smile that doesn't seek approval, in your silence that no longer hides fear, but holds power, in the way you walk away from conversations that once triggered you, and the way you choose yourself again and again without guilt. That's what makes the return unforgettable. It's not that you came back louder, it's that you came back lighter, sharper, and more sure of who you are. Not because someone asked you to be, but because you chose to become. So here's the truth. Power isn't in the silence alone. It's in what you do with it. It's in filling that space with growth, reflection, and intention. It's in letting go of the need to chase or prove, and instead building a life so rich that your presence becomes a privilege, not a guarantee. You create curiosity, not confusion, by being whole within yourself, not withholding from others. You allow someone to feel your absence, not as punishment, but as contrast. Because when you return, you don't return seeking, you return elevated. You return with clarity, with self-respect, with a renewed sense of who you are, and what you bring. And if they notice your shift, good. If they don't, even better, because this journey was never about them. It was about reclaiming your rhythm, your energy, and your voice. The silence was your reset. The substance was your growth. The mystery was your maturity. And now the return is your arrival, not to their life, but fully into your own. That's the real glow up. Not to be wanted again, but to never need to be. Because you finally see your worth, even if someone else couldn't. And that right there is your power.